A police officer pepper sprays a black boy without knowing his father is a Navy SEAL, and everything changes in an instant. If you believe no black child should be harmed by those sworn to protect, hit that subscribe button now. It was the kind of afternoon that made people forget the world had sharp edges. The sun filtered through the oaks and maples that lined the streets of Eastbridge, casting soft shadows over front lawns trimmed like military crews. Birds chirped in rhythm with the wind rustling through leaves, and in the quiet calm, 14-year-old Xavier Brooks stepped out of the local library balancing 3 thick books against his chest. Their spines read Naval Tactics of the 21st Century, Code of the Sea Warrior, and Field Survival, Elite Edition. Xavier was different from most boys his age. He didn't care for video games or TikTok dances. His mind was built like a compass, always reading, always preparing, always learning. He had a routine. Saturdays meant the library, followed by an hour at the park to study and practice. Not practice sports, but survival drills. His father had taught him how to pitch a shelter using just string and a jacket, how to stay calm in high-stress situations, and how to read a map by sun or shadow. To most, he seemed like a quiet, awkward boy with old habits, but those habits had been carved into him with purpose. As he walked toward the park, his steps steady and focused, the neighborhood around him bustled gently. A father pushed a stroller. A jogger waved at a passing dog. The world felt ordinary. Safe. Xavier adjusted his backpack and crossed the street. That's when he noticed the shouting. Across the road, 2 officers were confronting a middle-aged man next to a red pickup truck that was parked slightly over the white line. The officers, both white, both tall, stood with squared shoulders and arms crossed, flanking the man like sentries. The shorter officer, with sharp eyes and a narrow jawline, barked orders while gesturing toward the windshield. The other one, bulkier, leaned against the cruiser, yawning like it was all routine. Xavier gave the scene a passing glance. He had no interest in drama or arguments. His father had always said, "You win battles by knowing when to walk away." And so he did. He turned his gaze back to the sidewalk, his steps calm, his thoughts drifting toward the survival drills he wanted to try before sunset. Half a block later, he reached a small bench under a willow tree at the park's edge. He sat down, laid his books neatly beside him, and pulled out a folded map of a forest preserve 30 miles away. It was an old paper map his father had given him, a puzzle of trails, creeks, and emergency exits. With the late afternoon sun dipping, the natural light was growing dimmer. Xavier reached into his backpack, fished out a small black flashlight, and clicked it on. It was a tactical flashlight, sleek but harmless. He shone it onto the map, tracing the southern trail with his finger, calculating how long it might take to cross the ridge if rain fell midway. He didn't notice that across the street, Deputy Riggins had taken a second glance at him. "Hey, what's that kid doing?" Riggins muttered to his partner, Jenkins. Jenkins shrugged. "Probably some gadget. Leave him be." But Riggins had already stepped off the curb. His eyes narrowed. Something about the flashlight, black, metallic, cylindrical, triggered a switch in his head. He didn't wait to assess, didn't wait to question. Training told him to act fast, and so he did. "Drop it," Riggins shouted, his voice piercing the calm. Xavier looked up, startled, the flashlight still in his hand. "What?" "Drop it," the officer screamed again, sprinting toward him with one hand already reaching for his belt. Confused, Xavier stood up slowly, lowering the flashlight. "It's just—" But he didn't get to finish the sentence. In one sudden move, Riggins raised the canister of pepper spray and fired. A hissing stream of orange mist exploded into Xavier's face, hitting him square in the eyes. The boy dropped to the ground with a cry that pierced through every layer of stillness around them. He screamed in pain, clawing at his face. The books spilled. The map blew away in the breeze. His legs curled inward, his hands trembling. "Help!" Xavier cried, his voice hoarse and broken. People froze. A jogger stopped mid-stride. An elderly man on a bench clutched his cane. A teenage boy pulled out his phone and began recording. No one moved fast enough. Jenkins jogged over, eyes wide, but he didn't interfere. "Man, what are you doing? He's just a kid." "He had something in his hand," Riggins barked, still panting from the sprint. "Could have been anything." Jenkins looked at the flashlight lying on the grass. "It's a flashlight, Riggins." "He didn't comply," Riggins replied sharply, brushing off his vest like that settled it. "That's on him." A hush fell over the park, broken only by Xavier's groans and coughing. His eyes were burning. His chest was tight. The sting crawled under his skin like fire. From the jogging trail nearby, a figure slowed to a stop. Elijah Brooks had just returned from a light recon run through the wooded back path of the neighborhood, blending in with the weekend crowd in a gray t-shirt and track pants. Sweat dotted his temples, but his breath was calm. When he heard the scream, something instinctual kicked in. His muscles tensed, his posture shifted. Then he saw him. His son curled on the ground, his face twisted in agony, tears mixed with pepper spray. Officers looming above him, one shouting, one doing nothing. Elijah's mind went quiet, like flipping a switch. He moved quickly but without panic, weaving between stunned pedestrians until he reached Xavier's side. "I'm here," he said softly, kneeling. "Breathe. I've got you." Xavier's arms reached for him blindly, his face red and soaked. Elijah took out a water bottle from his pouch and poured some over his son's face, guiding the stream gently with his hand. Deputy Riggins stood above them, scowling. "He should have dropped it." Elijah looked up. He didn't say anything. His eyes locked onto Riggins' face, memorizing every detail, the slight twitch in the officer's jaw, the arrogant tilt of his shoulders, the casual dismissal in his voice. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably beside him, muttering, "Just another smart-mouthed kid." Elijah's jaw tightened, but still he said nothing. Instead, he turned back to Xavier, helping him sit up slowly, shielding his son from the lingering attention of onlookers. A few feet away, the teenager with the phone was still filming, his hands shaking slightly. The moment Elijah Brooks heard the scream, time slowed. He hadn't been far, just jogging the final stretch of his usual route, a light 5-mile recon he did to stay sharp. Dressed in a plain hoodie, black cargo joggers, and worn sneakers, he blended easily into the civilian crowd. But as soon as that sharp, panicked cry echoed across the park entrance, everything else faded. He knew that voice. The cry wasn't random. It wasn't just any child. It was Xavier. Elijah's eyes scanned the commotion near the intersection across from the park. A small group of pedestrians had gathered. At the center of the chaos, he saw his son crumpled on the ground, hands clutching his face, writhing in pain. The unmistakable hiss of pepper spray still lingered in the air. Deputy Riggins stood over him, barking orders. And in that moment, something shifted inside Elijah. Not rage, but precision. The part of him that once commanded silence behind enemy lines took over. He didn't run. He walked deliberately, calmly, crossing the street and slipping past the circle of onlookers like a shadow. As he reached Xavier, he knelt beside him without speaking. His son's breathing was ragged, fast. Tears streamed down his cheeks and the boy's fingers trembled against his burning eyes. "Xavier," Elijah said, voice low but steady. "It's me. I'm here." Xavier whimpered. "Dad, I didn't do anything. I was just trying to read." "I know," Elijah replied. His hand gently guided Xavier's to his lap. "Don't rub your eyes. Just stay still." Elijah reached into the side pocket of his jogging vest, pulling out a small bottle of water and a soft cloth. As he poured the cool liquid onto the fabric, he kept his eyes locked on Riggins. The deputy was still busy addressing the crowd, his voice tinged with authority and annoyance. "He had something in his hand, looked like a weapon. I acted according to protocol," Riggins said, gesturing to no one in particular. "That's how you stay alive out here. You don't hesitate." Elijah's jaw clenched. His hands never stopped moving, gently dabbing Xavier's eyes, shielding him from the sun. He said nothing. Not yet. Deputy Jenkins, the second officer, stood a few feet back, arms crossed, clearly uneasy. His eyes met Elijah's for a split second, then looked away. Jenkins didn't say a word, didn't offer help, didn't even call for backup. He just muttered under his breath, "Just another smart-mouthed kid," and turned his head toward the trees. Riggins had no idea who Elijah was. No idea that the quiet man tending to the injured boy had once trained SEAL teams in hostage extraction, high-risk intel gathering, and stealth dismantling of armed enemy cells. No idea that the man now watching him with dead calm eyes had once stood at the edge of a war zone and won through patience, not gunfire. "Sir, you need to step back," Riggins finally said, pointing at Elijah with authority. "We've got this under control." Elijah didn't flinch. "You've done enough." There was no emotion in his voice, just the cold steel of certainty. Riggins hesitated. There was something about the way Elijah said it, something that made him second-guess the usual bravado. But before he could respond, Elijah turned his focus back to Xavier, who was now breathing a little more evenly. A nearby civilian pulled out a phone. "I got it all on video," the man said quietly to Elijah. "Start to finish. Your son didn't do anything." Elijah gave a small nod. "Hold on to it. Don't post it yet." The man blinked, surprised. "You sure?" "This'll blow up online." "I don't want to fire," Elijah said, helping Xavier to his feet. "I want a blueprint." They walked slowly to a shaded bench under a tree near the library parking lot. Elijah sat his son down gently and called for medical assistance himself, directly, not through 911. He knew who to call. As the automated tone clicked off, he spoke into the phone with clarity. "Petty Eye, emergency, Code Frost, civilian minor, East Bridge Quadrant, immediate assistance, non-ambulatory." The operator on the other end responded with trained professionalism. "ETA 15 minutes, marked car, stand by for field medic." Elijah closed the call and looked at his son. "Help is coming." Xavier nodded faintly, still wiping his cheeks. Minutes passed. The crowd began to disperse. The officers were already gone, driving off without filing a single report. That night, after a doctor from a private veterans-linked clinic had examined Xavier's eyes and prescribed cooling gel and rest, Elijah stood quietly outside his son's room. The boy had fallen asleep, the light from the hallway casting a soft glow over the edge of the bed. Elijah stared for a long moment. Not at his son, but at the unopened footlocker at the end of the hallway. He hadn't opened that locker in years. It was old, scuffed, covered in faded stickers from distant places with names few civilians could pronounce. It held no weapons, no medals, just documents, drives, and identities. His past life, organized into files and folders, waiting quietly for a reason to be remembered. Elijah stepped into his study and knelt before the locker. His fingers lingered on the latch before flipping it open with a soft click. The lid creaked. Inside, everything was just as he left it, compartmentalized, efficient, untouched. There were encrypted USB sticks, redacted dossiers, numbers not saved in any phone, only remembered by trained memory, faces, men, operations that had never been acknowledged. He pulled out a leather-bound notepad, one that held the contacts written in cipher. Turning to a fresh page, he began writing. Names, timelines, connections. Not of enemies, but of allies. The people who owed him. Not money, not favors, but honor. Deputy Riggins had made a mistake, but not just in judgment, in calculation. He hadn't assaulted the son of a random bystander. He'd targeted the son of a man who spent 2 decades planning, watching, executing, and dismantling systems. Elijah had no interest in going viral or filing lawsuits that would die in red tape. That would only lead to damage control and silence. He didn't want silence. He wanted exposure. He wanted a light shone on the dark, dry rot within a system that trained officers to assume threat over humanity, to fire or spray before assessing, to act out of fear instead of skill. And Elijah had always been strategic, not explosive. Strategic. He made a few calls that night, short, cryptic conversations with old colleagues. One was now a private auditor with connections in state security boards. Another was a cybersecurity expert who maintained access to local police databases. A third was Vaughn, a fellow SEAL who had transitioned into domestic intelligence after retiring. "Need eyes on a small-town department?" Elijah said plainly. There was a pause. "Name?" "Elijah Brooks." "No," Vaughn said with quiet amusement. "I meant the town, but noted. I'll get to work." Elijah closed the call, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the moon outside his window. There was no rage in his expression, no desperation, only resolve. His son had been hurt, but the wound went deeper than pepper spray. It was about every child who got profiled for a gesture, every officer who saw skin before seeing humanity, every culture of silence that protected the wrong people and punished the innocent. And Elijah knew this was bigger than his son, so he started drawing the first lines of a plan. Not for revenge, for correction. The morning air outside Eastbridge Police Department was crisp and still, as if the town itself were holding its breath. But inside the station walls, a quiet storm was beginning to brew. A thick white envelope had arrived, stamped with the seal of the State Security Oversight Board. Its contents were simple, yet terrifying. An official audit request. The notice demanded full transparency within 72 hours. Every piece of body cam footage from the past month, every disciplinary report, every evaluation from recent training seminars. It was a direct order, and there was no time to prepare spin. Sergeant Mallory was the first to read the letter. He frowned, blinking twice to make sure he wasn't imagining it. "This wasn't scheduled," he murmured, tapping the document with the back of his pen. A young desk officer hovered nearby. "Should I call Chief Weller?" he asked. Mallory didn't answer. He was already on the move, briskly walking down the hallway toward Internal Affairs, the envelope tucked under his arm like a live grenade. Meanwhile, in the locker room on the second floor, Deputy Riggins was bragging. Again. Shirt half-buttoned, badge dangling from his locker hook, he recounted the weekend incident to a fellow officer with exaggerated flair. "Kid froze like a statue," Riggins said, laughing, mimicking the moment with an outstretched arm and invisible canister. "Didn't even get a word out before I lit him up. That'll teach him not to wave things around like that." Officer Jenkins stood a few feet away, back turned, pretending to scroll through his phone. His jaw was tight. He hadn't said a word since the incident, but his silence wasn't from agreement. It was guilt. He had seen the fear in that boy's eyes. He'd heard the scream, seen the tears, and worst of all, he'd done nothing. Now the rumors of an audit were floating through the halls like wildfire. Jenkins knew they weren't just rumors. Something had been set in motion, something bigger than a routine review. He could feel it. Across town, in a small windowless room beneath an old veterans' hall, Elijah Brooks sat in front of a laptop. The screen displayed a secure chat interface, black background, green text. On the other end of the encrypted line was Commander Vaughn, a fellow SEAL turned intelligence analyst. Elijah trusted very few men in this world. Vaughn was one of them. "Got what you asked for," Vaughn typed. Moments later, a series of files began downloading. Internal memos, scanned complaints, suppressed footage timestamps. Elijah's eyes didn't blink. He scanned every document like a surgeon examining an X-ray. 3 citizen complaints in the last 18 months, Vaughn's next message read. All dismissed internally. One involved excessive force on a 12-year-old. Another involved a homeless man with a broken arm. No follow-up. No video released. Elijah exhaled slowly. "That's a pattern," he muttered. His fingers moved quickly. He created a timeline, matching incidents with police shift logs, locating gaps and discrepancies. One report showed a 2-minute redaction in Riggins' body cam footage. Another showed a signed document by a sergeant who was supposedly off duty that day. It was sloppy, but common. Elijah wasn't surprised, but now he had names, dates, and evidence. He leaned back, staring at a wall lined with old photographs, him in uniform, medals pinned across his chest, foreign flags in the background. He had faced enemies with rifles and RPGs, but nothing felt as personal as this. He clicked a final folder, Eastern Sector Contacts. It held phone numbers and encrypted codes tied to civilian watchdogs and political figures who still owed him favors from past operations. One name in particular stood out, Major Ron Acker, now a liaison between military oversight and local governance. Elijah tapped the number and hit send. The call connected within seconds. "Elijah." Acker's voice was cautious, professional. "I have a situation in Eastbridge. Officer misconduct, covered up records. Need your back channel open." A pause. "You think this'll escalate?" "It already has," Elijah replied. "I just need it framed right. Not as a vendetta, just as a truth overdue." "Understood. Send the file. I'll flag it directly to the mayor's review board. No delay." Elijah didn't smile. He didn't thank him. He just nodded, even though Acker couldn't see him. Then he transferred the full report, 200 megabytes of carefully organized misconduct, into an encrypted drive and sent it off. His next move would involve walking right into the station, not as a father, but as someone who used to train special ops officers on how to handle crisis situations with control and clarity. Only those who stand with black families and true justice will subscribe. Real ones never look away. The glass doors of the Eastbridge Police Department slid open with a gentle hiss, breaking the still air of a late Monday morning. Fluorescent lights buzzed above polished floors, and the quiet clatter of keyboards and distant phones echoed through the lobby. A few officers milled about behind the reception desk, half focused on paperwork, half lulled by routine. Then he walked in. Elijah Brooks didn't look like a threat. Dressed in a black polo, ironed slacks, and plain running shoes, he carried no visible weapon, wore no badge. His walk was steady, posture precise, not aggressive, just grounded. His expression was unreadable, like still water hiding its depth. He approached the front desk with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step aside without knowing why. The officer on duty, a young man with a badge that read Turner, looked up. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, glancing briefly at the visitor log. Elijah didn't speak right away. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather case. Inside was a laminated ID that hadn't seen sunlight in years. He slid it across the counter in silence. Turner blinked. His eyes scanned the card, then widened slightly. One moment, please." Within 90 seconds, the chief of police himself appeared at the top of the stairs overlooking the lobby. Chief Raymond Carr was in his late 50s, stocky, gray-haired, and usually slow-moving. But today, he descended like a man who had just realized his office might be under siege, not by weapons, but by something more dangerous. Exposure. "Elijah Brooks," the chief said, extending a hand. Elijah shook it once, firmly but without warmth. "We need a room. Private, now." The chief nodded quickly. "Follow me." They entered a small conference room with glass walls covered by blinds. A long oak table sat in the middle, surrounded by 8 chairs, one of which squeaked loudly as Elijah pulled it out. A large monitor was mounted on the far wall, beneath which sat an HDMI cable. Elijah got straight to it. "I won't take much of your time, but you'll want to see this." He pulled a flash drive from his pocket and plugged it into the wall unit. The screen lit up. The chief folded his arms, trying to look composed. though his shoulders tensed as the footage began. There was no sound at first, just images. Xavier on the sidewalk, squinting at a map. Riggins shouting something inaudible. Then the pepper spray. The scream. The chaos. The chief's face shifted. What began as curiosity turned to concern, then unease, and finally, embarrassment. He opened his mouth to speak, but Elijah raised a hand to stop him. "That's not all." Elijah slid a folder across the table. Neatly clipped pages detailed Officer Riggins' prior misconduct reports, use of force complaints, body cam irregularities, citizen testimonies. The next section outlined critical failures in Eastbridge's de-escalation training program, with timestamps and notes that made it impossible to deny. The chief flipped through the pages in silence, his jaw tight. "I'm not here to argue," Elijah said quietly but firmly. "I'm not here to demand money, or cameras, or hashtags. I'm here because my son can't see straight out of his right eye this week, because your officer saw a flashlight and assumed it was a threat, and because your department trained him to react, not assess." The chief looked up. "This is damning. But you have to understand, Riggins, he's been under pressure. He's not—" "Stop," Elijah interrupted. He leaned forward, voice low but sharp. "I don't care what pressure he's under. I've led teams into buildings where children were used as human shields. We were trained not to pull the trigger unless it was absolutely necessary. Your officer pepper-sprayed a child because of a flashlight." Silence pressed down like weight. Elijah sat back, then said the line that would shift the entire conversation. "You have 48 hours to fix this, or I take it federal." The chief blinked, unsure whether it was a threat or a warning. Elijah stood up. "You won't hear from me again until then." He walked out of the room, leaving behind the folder and a room thick with dread. That night, the Eastbridge Police Department was anything but calm. Emails were flagged for internal review. The HR director was called in after hours. Officer Riggins was placed on administrative leave, though no one told him why. He found out the next morning when his access badge failed at the station entrance. Officer Jenkins, who had stood by during the incident, was pulled aside for an unscheduled review. Across town, Elijah met with someone he trusted, a former war correspondent named Clay Hendricks. They sat at a corner booth of an old diner that still served black coffee in cracked white mugs. "Still remember how to record without making it feel like a spotlight?" Elijah asked, sipping quietly. Clay chuckled. "You're not asking me for an interview. You're asking for a broadcast." "I'm asking for the truth," Elijah replied. "We control the narrative before someone else spins it." The following week, a short documentary aired during prime time on a national news network titled The Hidden Fight at Home. It opened with footage of Xavier being pepper-sprayed and cut to a quiet interview with Elijah Brooks, who finally revealed his identity to the public. "I've spent 20 years fighting foreign threats," he said calmly, "but the greatest threat to my son's safety came from a man who was supposed to protect him." The segment exposed a trail of negligence, training gaps, and racial bias that had festered within Eastbridge PD. Public outcry followed, and state officials launched an open investigation into use-of-force incidents across multiple towns. Riggins, realizing the fallout, tried to resign quietly, but his badge was already flagged in the National Misconduct Registry, a system Elijah's contacts helped revive. Xavier, though still shaken, spoke briefly at a press conference alongside his father. "I don't want him fired," he said about Riggins. "I want him retrained or removed, because next time, it might not be pepper spray." That line would be quoted in dozens of headlines. Behind the scenes, Elijah was already working with a task force to design a federal pilot program, teaching tactical patience and racial bias recognition. Quiet correction. The wind carried a crisp edge that morning as the sun filtered through the trees lining the Eastbridge Park Trail. Birds chirped in slow rhythm, undisturbed by the changes that had quietly reshaped the town over the last 3 months. On a bench beneath a tall elm, Xavier Brooks sat with a hardback book resting open in his lap. The title, Leadership Under Fire, gleamed faintly in the dappled sunlight. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the page with quiet concentration. He was no longer just a boy studying military strategy. He had become, unknowingly, a symbol, one whose pain had sparked a fire across the state. A few yards away, Commander Elijah Brooks watched him. The former Navy SEAL stood near a shaded trail, arms folded, legs firm, his gaze steady. He wasn't dressed in uniform or tactical gear, just a dark brown jacket over a gray sweater, jeans, and boots. But something about the way he stood, unmoving yet fully alert, revealed the discipline forged by decades of training. His eyes weren't only on his son, they were watching the world around them, always reading, always prepared. Eastbridge had changed. The police department now operated under a new structure, one with teeth. A civilian oversight panel had been established following a sweeping investigation that exposed years of misconduct, buried complaints, and training failures. The town council, once resistant, now held open forums every month. Officers like Jenkins, who had turned away in moments of crisis, were suspended pending review, and others voluntarily stepped down. The department's old motto, "Order through action," had been replaced with one that Elijah himself proposed, "Courage through conscience." But real change, Elijah knew, couldn't be written into slogans or enforced through press conferences. It had to be lived, day by day. It had to be taught. A sudden rustle in the leaves caught Elijah's ear. He shifted slightly, scanning for movement. From around the path's bend came a figure, young, thin, and clearly nervous. The rookie officer's uniform looked almost too big for his frame. His hat was off, tucked respectfully under one arm. As he walked, his steps were hesitant, eyes locked on Xavier, who hadn't yet looked up from his book. The rookie stopped a few feet away from the bench, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his cap. "Xavier?" he asked, his voice steady but soft. Xavier blinked, looking up. Recognition flashed across his face, not of the man, but of the uniform. His fingers curled slightly around the book, his body instinctively tensing, just a little. The officer noticed. He slowly knelt down, keeping his posture humble, almost like a student before a teacher. "I just wanted to say—" He paused, taking a breath. "I'm sorry. Not just for what happened to you, but for what people like me didn't do soon enough." Xavier stared at him, silent. The officer continued. "I wasn't on duty that day, but I saw the footage. I saw how nobody helped. I joined the academy because I wanted to protect people, not hurt them. But now I realize protection takes more than a badge. It takes listening. It takes courage. I'm still learning that." Elijah, still standing at a distance, listened. He could hear every word, could read the sincerity in the young officer's voice. He stepped forward, gravel crunching beneath his boots. The officer rose to his feet quickly, stiffening out of instinct, unsure whether to salute or apologize again. But Elijah didn't scold or scrutinize. He simply extended his hand. The rookie hesitated, then took it. "Teach the others," Elijah said, his voice low and firm. "What you said here, today, say it in the locker rooms, in the training sessions, on the streets. One apology can't change a culture, but leadership can." The officer nodded, visibly moved. "Yes, sir, I will." As he walked away, Elijah turned back toward Xavier, who had now stood up, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves. For a moment, father and son just looked at each other. No words, just an understanding. They had both changed. The world had seen what happened to Xavier and responded. But it wasn't justice until the next boy in his position didn't get pepper sprayed. Until the next officer chose to intervene. That was the mission now. Later that afternoon, Elijah was invited to a panel meeting at Eastbridge Civic Hall, where the new Oversight Board was assembling for the first time with full authority. The room was modest, with wooden benches and old brass fixtures, but it was filled with faces from every part of the community: teachers, veterans, business owners, and, yes, officers. Elijah sat at the head table, not as a guest, but as a permanent advisor. He took the microphone only once that day. "We are not here to destroy the system," he said. "We are here to rebuild it, with honesty, accountability, and wisdom. It starts with every decision made in silence, every small moment where someone chooses to look away or to step in." His words were met with quiet nods. There was no applause, just understanding. It was exactly how he wanted it. That evening, Xavier returned home to find a letter waiting for him, a handwritten note from a professor at a military academy, inviting him to a summer leadership program for youth scholars. He didn't show it to his father immediately. He just smiled faintly, folded it into his book, and looked out the window at the darkening sky. In the stillness of their living room, Elijah poured 2 glasses of iced tea and set one down next to Xavier without saying a word. He sat across from him, the two of them sipping in silence. Outside, the sound of sirens faded into the distance, quieter now, less urgent, not because trouble had vanished, but because change had begun to take root. A week later, Elijah met with federal consultants to finalize the framework of a new pilot program. It would be tested in 3 towns across the state, including Eastbridge. The focus: tactical patience, real-time accountability, and racial bias training based on psychological resilience rather than surface-level checklists. "Will it work?" one of the consultants asked during the briefing. Elijah looked up from the document. "It'll work if they want it to. But if they don't, we'll know, and we'll try again. That's what a mission is. Not one strike, but every step forward." He closed the folder. Back at the park the following weekend, Elijah and Xavier sat side by side, quietly watching a local youth group practice drills under a volunteer officer's guidance. The leader was none other than the young rookie who had knelt in front of Xavier just days earlier. This time, he wasn't apologizing. He was teaching, and Xavier, still quiet, still sharp, watched with a gaze that said everything. This was what his father meant. Not revenge, not punishment, purpose. They thought he was alone. He was protected by the deadliest man alive. If that moment gave you chills, subscribe and stand with real power. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, created to highlight the consequences of police misconduct and the power of standing up against injustice. Its purpose is to raise awareness about fairness, accountability, and the importance of respecting all individuals regardless of their background.